It is the objective of this presentation to present science and humanitarian awards to some of the greatest discoverers of how to use the forces of nature that could and should have transformed our way of life. But in our topsy-turvy world, where truth is inverted and real transforming technologies are suppressed and replaced by what is spun to the public as breakthrough technology, these typically being no more than small incremental improvements to existing technologies, such as university research projects to increase efficiency of loft insulation by a few percent, or research which has zero uses for 99% of the population. Some of these enlightening research discoveries including surprisingly, the bastion of establishment rectitude, that is the conspiracy-free Daily Telegraph, agrees with this. Announced as the top 3 scientific advances of 2025 were artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and CRISPR gene editing technology, which, contrary to their advocates that these will benefit humanity, in reality are more advanced tools for the use of the Davos elite to get richer and further manipulate and control the rest of us. 3 leading pioneers of artificial intelligence, Geoffrey Hinton, Professor Stuart Russell, and Yoshua Bengio, have now warned of the dire threat that AI poses. CRISPR gene editing means that Frankenstein no longer has to be assembled externally from body parts. He can now be injected and grown. And as the new gene splice is patentable, the recipient is likely to no longer own his own body, but belong to a corporation that can now truly play God and create a Frankenstein or an entirely new species of any living organism, regardless of the long-term consequences. The greatest advancements in science have not come from research projects of mainstream science, but from maverick visionaries who have dared to think and experiment with what the mainstream has dismissed. And it is these visionaries from yesterday and today that this presentation wishes to award, visionaries such as John Worrell Keely. John Keely was one of the greatest geniuses of all time, who purely by means of sound vibrations discovered how to use sound to not only do useful work to drive motors, but was able to reduce hard rocks to powder, levitate any mass, and reduced substances to 3 different levels of the primordial ethers from which all matter is made, what is known today as zero-point energy, all in a safely controlled manner without harmful effects. And so I give Science and Humanitarian Awards to John Worrell Keely, whose technological discoveries in the 19th century meant that energy, transportation, flight, and more would have been freely available if it hadn't been suppressed. Over 1,000 pages of technical data removed. The crude burning of coal, oil, and gas for energy would have been unnecessary for over 100 years. My next award is to a well-known genius visionary, Nikola Tesla. Tesla, who invented the alternating current electricity system in use throughout the world today. This was acceptable to the establishment because, unlike Keely's devices, AC electricity can be easily controlled, metered and charged for. But his subsequent technical discoveries of unmeterable free electricity and later individual power units that could indefinitely power a house or a car took him into Keely territory, and he therefore received similar treatment. Finally, just before his death, Tesla had developed the blueprints for the propulsion system of his aircraft. He called it Space Drive, or the Anti-Electromagnetic Field Propulsion System. After his death, all of Nikola Tesla's research papers were seized by the US government and remain classified to this day at the Robert J. Oppenheimer Research Center. By 1916, scientists with the best microscopes at that time could obtain a magnification of 2,500 times, which would allow them to see a mold, many parasites and bacteria, but not anything smaller such as a virus. Rife designed a new type of microscope working on different principles that could magnify up to 60,000 times and observe living life forms without destroying them, unlike modern electron microscopes. This new ability to be able to watch a live virus allowed him to experiment with the idea of breaking them down by vibrating them with their resonant frequency, just like an opera singer shattering a wine glass with her voice. This led to the creation of his beam ray devices, which using radio waves could be adjusted to send out the exact frequency to destroy a particular virus or other disease organism.
It's coordinated resonance. The same as I say, you take 2 tuning forks that's pitched at a C or an A absolute, you strike one, the other one resonates. So we're showing an electronic frequency through the tissues of the body that simply devitalizes the bacteria with no harm to normal tissue.
Rife also described how he found all the frequencies that would kill the various microorganisms.
I stood in front of that thing for 30 years, finding these different frequencies that devitalize these different bacteria, and that thing was shooting on me right here. But it is absolutely harmless to normal tissue, and each individual bacteria requiring a different frequency to devitalize. How do you arrive at the frequency of the bacteria? How do we arrive? We put the specimen of the bacteria under the microscope, and we tune this device sometimes months before we find a frequency that will devitalize or precipitate or break up this. In other words, you have to keep trying frequencies until you, yes.
In 1934, the University of Southern California arranged for terminal cancer patients from Pasadena County Hospital to be brought to Rife's San Diego laboratory for treatment. 4 months later, the total recovery rate using Rife's technology was 100%. After this, the inevitable happened when the American Medical Association, closely connected to the pharmaceutical industry, attempted to buy out all of Rife's work. Rife refused, and the harassment started. A Science and Humanitarian Award to Royal Raymond Rife. As a postscript, the two major contemporary Rife-inspired research products are as follows. Victor Schauberger was an Austrian forester who observed that trout could maintain their position in a stream of fast-moving water virtually without moving. They could also leap up waterfalls. He concluded that they were able to create a force against the flow of the water. His experiments proved that the fish were generating vortices in their gills, which released a sufficient amount of what is now referred to as zero-point energy to oppose the flow of the water. His first use as a forester was to float heavy timber down a mountain in a log flume. From his discoveries, Schauberger made mechanical devices that could concentrate and release this energy to a very high degree. He went on to make a device to create proper energized spring water, a special plough that made nitrogen fertilizer unnecessary, and several versions of a home electricity generator he called a trout turbine, and later a tornado generator. But the culmination of his discoveries was to make a device he called the repulsine, which would release sufficient zero-point energy to overcome gravity. They were about 1.5 meters in diameter, and when they had reached sufficient rotational speed, would rise up suddenly. At this juncture, the Second World War intervened, and Schauberger was summoned to a personal meeting with Fourth Reichsfuhrer Himmler, where he was told, forced to work with the prisoners of war, large quantities of the flying discs were made and sent up in swarms into the Allied forces' planes, causing the electrical ignition systems of the planes to fail. These were called by the Allied pilots Foo Fighters. After the war, Schauberger was arrested for a year by the American forces and warned not to continue with energy research. In 1958, Schauberger went to America to accept an offer to commercialize his inventions. He returned a broken man, repeating, "They took everything from me, everything. I don't even own myself," and died a few days later. Science and Humanitarian Awards to Victor Schauberger. Somewhere around the Wiltshire and Birmingham areas, a group of industrialists and engineers, hearing stories from the wartime pilots about Foo Fighters, came together in 1950 to see if they could reproduce this technology. Their agreement was this was to be done in secret. They called themselves the ONL Group. They were looking for radical engineering ideas to experiment with, and these appeared from an enigmatic, troubled visionary called John Searle. John proposed a rotating magnet system, arranged like a roller bearing, the magnets magnetized by an unusual magnetizing process. The results of their experiments were an electrical generator that could power a home or vehicle, and an electrogravitic flying craft, similar to Schauberger's devices, but being magnetic-based, easier to control. These experimental flying craft ranged from 3 feet to 10 feet in diameter, and were remote controlled by a shortwave radio transmitter, which can be seen in the bottom right picture. The middle bottom picture, taken in 1968, shows the 10-foot P-11 flying craft, about 80 foot high, with an ionized air halo around it. Faintly in the background is a blurred-out electricity pylon. Shortly after these flights, in 1968, the ONL Group were warned to cease and desist with all work on electrogravitics, which they did. John Searle, now without manufacturing facilities or finance, and his obligation of secrecy, decided to go public. Those that didn't want this technology to see the light of day were happy to see John receive the typical British tabloid treatment for several years. But then in May 1981, The Sun reported that an official from the Maverick Laker Airways was interested after witnessing a demonstration. 9 months later, in 1982, the British government conspired with British Airways, and Laker Airways was put out of business. Later that year, while John was away, neighbours reported that American military and 2 British policemen were seen removing things from his house, all relevant technology seized. Science and Humanitarian Awards to John Searle and the ONL Group. Alchemy, or the changing of one element into another with the basic laboratory equipment, derided over the years as nonsense by official science, received a shock in 1989, when it was announced by Stanley Pons and Martin Fleischmann that they had achieved some kind of atomic reaction in a small flask that generated excess heat without any dangerous radioactive waste or radiation. This posed a direct threat to the research gravy train of hot fusion that from 1950s to date has consumed between $120 and $150 billion and not produced a single watt of usable energy. So the discrediting started immediately. Next, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology declared in record time that Pons and Fleischmann's results couldn't be reproduced by them. This was followed by other negative statements by Professor of Chemistry Nathan Lewis of Caltech University. These statements, which implied error or fraud by Pons and Fleischmann, were publicized worldwide, closing the door to any further research by official bodies. Some years later, Dr. Eugene Mallove of Infinite Energy magazine was one of the first to discover and eventually prove that it was the naysayers who were in error and that the published MIT experimental data's graph axis had been fraudulently adjusted to show no excess heat. Instead of publishing the MIT upper black data showing excess heat, the lower blue data was published worldwide showing no excess heat. Eugene Mallove, who continued to publish this and other real alternative energy devices, was murdered in May 2004. Science and Humanitarian Awards to Pons and Fleischmann and Eugene Mallove. On a more positive note, there is currently a quite brilliant British experimental physicist and communicator, Bob Greenyer, who is coordinating the open-source Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project, or MFMP. This is an open-source project in which experimenters around the world are participating who have vindicated the claims of Pons and Fleischmann that low-energy nuclear reactions exist and one element can be changed into another. Over the last 10 years, they have devised numerous experiments which prove beyond doubt that not only are LNERs possible, but they are occurring all the time in the natural environment in high-pressure storms, lightning, tornadoes, and vortices of many types. One of their very simple and inexpensive experiments, called the Ultra, uses an ultrasonic cleaner, some water, and aluminium foil in which microvortices are created in the water, which transmutes some of the aluminium into tiny iron particles. Other experiments conducted have suggested that oil is not a fossil fuel, but is constantly being produced by transmutation. An exciting example, which is a working practical demonstration of these discoveries, is the Australian Malcolm Bendall's thunderstorm generator. Malcolm has reproduced the effects of very high-pressure storm vortices into a device that can be fitted to any internal combustion engine, which transmutes the exhaust emissions into oxygen.
Hit it. Go and have a look at the probe.
The probe reveals that the greatly reduced carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide and some nitrogen has been transmuted into 17.5% oxygen. Science and Humanitarian Awards to Bob Greenyer and Malcolm Bendall.